The champagne glass shattered so hard against the hardwood floor that the entire ballroom-style patio went silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that only happens when something deeply unexpected cracks the air wide open. A second earlier, my cousin Rick had been laughing so hard he nearly spilled barbecue sauce on his white polo shirt. "Let me guess," he snorted loudly enough for half the party to hear. "They called you princess." I'd taken a slow sip of iced tea before answering. Hades. That was it, just one word. But the retired Navy SEAL standing near the outdoor bar dropped his champagne glass like he'd seen a ghost. The old man stared at me with pale blue eyes that suddenly looked 20 years younger and 20 years more afraid. "No," he whispered. Then he stood up straight and saluted me, right there in front of my entire family. That was the moment my cousin realized he'd made a terrible mistake. The barbecue was supposed to be simple. Just one afternoon. My Aunt Donna's 75th birthday party out near Waco, Texas. Nothing fancy, folding chairs, country music drifting from old speakers, men arguing about football beside smokers full of brisket, grandkids running around with popsicles melting down their wrists. Real American family stuff. I almost didn't come. Truthfully, I hadn't attended one of these gatherings in nearly 8 years. Families remember things, especially the embarrassing things. And in my family, I was mostly remembered as the strange one, the quiet one, the woman who disappeared into the army and never really came back. Most of them assumed I had worked some forgettable desk job pushing paperwork around military offices. I never corrected them. It was easier that way. At 53 years old, I'd learned something most people only understand after enough funerals: peace matters more than recognition. Still, Aunt Donna had called personally. "Claire," she'd said softly over the phone, "I'm getting old, sweetheart. I'd really love to see you." So I drove the 3 hours. I brought peach cobbler. And I promised myself I'd leave before sunset if Rick started drinking too much. Unfortunately, Rick started drinking before noon. My cousin had always been loud in the way insecure men usually are. He wasn't evil, just arrogant. The type who believed volume was the same thing as confidence. He sold RVs outside Dallas and treated every conversation like he was trying to win Employee of the Month. By the time I arrived, he was already working through imported beer and holding court near the grill. "Well, look who finally came back from Area 51, he barked when he saw me. A few people laughed. I smiled politely. "You still alive, Rick?" "Barely. Inflation's trying to kill me." That got another round of laughter. I hugged Aunt Donna, kissed her cheek, helped carry trays from the kitchen to the patio while everyone else sat around debating politics and gas prices. Nobody noticed. I preferred it that way. Around 4 o'clock, a black SUV rolled into the driveway. Out stepped an older man wearing a navy blazer despite the Texas heat. Tall, lean, white hair cut military short. Even before Aunt Donna introduced him, I recognized the posture. Combat veterans carry themselves differently. Doesn't matter how old they get. "This is Walter Briggs," Aunt Donna announced proudly. "He served with Harold years ago." Harold had been her late husband. Walter shook hands around the patio until his eyes landed on me. For a split second, something changed in his expression. Recognition, then confusion, then uncertainty. I looked away first. I should have known right then the day was about to go sideways. By early evening, Rick had moved from annoying to obnoxious. He'd gathered a small audience around the patio cooler and started telling stories about his high school football days like he'd almost made the NFL. I was sitting quietly near the railing, watching sunlight settle over the fields beyond Aunt Donna's property, when Rick wandered over holding a beer. So he said loudly, "You ever actually do anything dangerous in the army?" I shrugged. "Sometimes." "What's that mean?" "It means sometimes." A few cousins chuckled. Rick grinned wider. "You shoot guns and all that?" "Occasionally." "Fight anybody?" His tone had that teasing edge men use when they think they're cornering someone. I could feel Walter Briggs watching from across the patio. I should have shut the conversation down. Instead, maybe because I was tired. Or maybe because after 20 years I was exhausted, pretending to be smaller than I was. I answered honestly. "Only hand to hand," I said calmly. Knives were optional. The entire group burst out laughing. Rick slapped the table. "Oh, come on." I smiled into my tea glass. Then came the line. "Let me guess." He laughed. "They called you princess." I looked him directly in the eye. Hades. The champagne glass shattered 1 second later. Walter Briggs had gone completely pale. Not shocked pale, haunted pale. The old SEAL stared at me like he was looking straight through 20 years of buried memories. "No damn way," he whispered. Rick blinked. "What?" Walter slowly approached me. "You were Task Unit 7, he said quietly. I didn't answer. You flew Kandahar extraction routes? Still silent. Walter's breathing changed. My family looked back and forth between us, confused. Rick forced out a laugh. Okay, hold on, what's happening? Walter ignored him completely. He looked at me the way soldiers look at graves. I heard you were dead. The patio had gone still except for distant cicadas buzzing in the trees. I set my glass down carefully. Not dead, I said softly. Walter's eyes glistened slightly. My God, he whispered. Hades. Then in front of my entire family. The retired Navy SEAL straightened his back and saluted me. And for the first time in my life, my cousin stopped laughing. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Walter Briggs saluted me. Not even Rick. And trust me, getting Rick Donnelly to stop talking was impressive enough to qualify as a small miracle. The Texas evening breeze moved softly through the oak trees around Aunt Donna's property while everybody stared at me like I'd suddenly grown another head. I hated attention. Always had. That surprise people felt when they discovered who I used to be. It never felt satisfying the way movies make it seem. Mostly it just made me tired. Rick finally forced out an awkward laugh. Okay, he said, glancing around nervously. What exactly is going on here? Walter didn't answer immediately. The old SEAL kept staring at me with the kind of expression veterans only wear around certain names, certain memories. Finally, he looked at Rick. You got any idea who your cousin is? Rick smirked weakly. Apparently not. Walter nodded slowly. No, he said. Apparently not. Aunt Donna looked deeply confused now. Claire, she asked carefully, what is he talking about? I sighed softly and leaned back in my chair. Nothing important. Walter immediately shook his head. With respect, he said that's not true. I could feel every pair of eyes on me now. My younger cousins had stopped chasing their kids around the yard. Even the country music humming from the speakers suddenly seemed too loud. I hated this. For 20 years I'd worked very hard to become invisible. And invisibility is hard-earned, especially after war. Walter finally pulled out a chair and sat across from me. You really disappeared, he murmured. I meant to. He gave a quiet laugh through his nose. Hell, people talked about you like a ghost story. Rick folded his arms. Okay, somebody better start explaining. Walter glanced toward him. You ever hear soldiers talk about call signs? Sure. Well, Walter said carefully, most call signs are jokes, nicknames, dumb stories. He pointed toward me. Not that one. Rick looked at me, then back at Walter. You're serious? Walter's eyes never left mine. Son, there were Rangers, SEALs, Marines, pilots, men who owed their lives to her. The patio fell silent again. I could almost hear people mentally replaying every assumption they'd ever made about me. The weird cousin, the quiet loner, the unmarried woman who lived alone outside Temple with her old truck and vegetable garden. Funny how people build entire stories around silence. Rick scoffed lightly, trying to recover. Come on, he said, you're acting like she was Rambo. Walter's expression hardened instantly. No, he said quietly. Rambo was fiction. That shut Rick up. Aunt Donna slowly sat beside me. Claire, sweetheart, what did you do in the army? I looked down at my hands for a moment. At my age, your hands tell stories before your mouth does. Scars, burn marks, old fractures. I flew medevac support, I said simply. Walter corrected me immediately. You flew black zone extraction. I closed my eyes briefly. Still hated hearing those words. Most civilians have no idea what military pilots actually do in war zones. They imagine movies, flags, hero speeches. Real war is usually exhaustion mixed with terror. And helicopters, God. Helicopters are where fear becomes physical. You feel every vibration in your bones. Every sound matters. Every second matters. Walter leaned back slowly. Kandahar, he murmured. Fall of 2003. I said nothing. Rick frowned. What happened in Kandahar? Walter looked toward the darkening fields beyond the patio. The mission went bad. His voice had changed now. Quieter. Older. There was a SEAL recon unit trapped after an ambush outside the city. Sandstorm rolling in. Visibility collapsing. Enemy fighters everywhere. Several relatives were completely still now, Walter continued. Command told air support to back off. He looked directly at me. But one pilot ignored the order. I stared at my untouched tea. That wasn't bravery, I said quietly. It was anger. Walter shook his head. No, he replied. It was courage. I almost laughed at that. People who survive war often get called courageous by people who never saw how much fear was involved. Truth is, courage usually feels ugly, messy, desperate. Rick still looked unconvinced. So what, she rescued some soldiers? Walter turned toward him slowly. Son, he said, those men were already considered dead. That landed differently. Even Rick felt it. Walter pointed gently toward me. She flew into a sandstorm nobody else would touch. My throat tightened slightly. I still remembered the radio static, the screaming alarms, the taste of blood where I'd bitten through my lip. Some memories never fade. They just get quieter with age, Walter continued. The helicopter got hit twice. Aunt Donna gasped softly. But she still landed. Nobody spoke. Even the little kids nearby seemed to sense something heavy in the air. Rick cleared his throat. Well, if all this is true, why haven't we ever heard about it? That answer came easily. Because I didn't want you to. Everyone looked at me again. I finally lifted my eyes. You know what happens after enough war? I asked quietly. Nobody answered. You stop wanting attention. The breeze shifted across the patio. Somewhere down the road a dog barked. Very normal sounds. That's the strange thing about life-changing moments. The world keeps moving anyway. Walter studied me carefully. You still blame yourself. I gave him a tired smile. Occupational hazard. He leaned forward. You saved 31 men. Not all of them. Walter's face darkened slightly. No, he admitted quietly. That old ache moved through my chest again. Not sharp anymore. Just familiar. Aunt Donna reached over and gently touched my arm. Oh, Claire. I looked away. I'd spent decades making sure nobody pitied me. Pity was dangerous. Once people start feeling sorry for veterans, they stop seeing them as human beings. They either turn you into a hero or a tragedy. Neither one feels real. Rick suddenly shifted awkwardly beside the cooler. So, he rubbed the back of his neck. Why'd they call you Hades? Walter answered before I could. Because no matter how bad the situation got, he paused. She always went into hell to bring people home. Nobody laughed after that. Not one person. The sun had nearly disappeared now, painting the Texas sky orange and purple beyond the trees. Walter kept staring at me with unsettled eyes. Then his expression changed. Not admiration this time. Concern. Deep concern. Claire, he said carefully, why did you disappear after Kandahar? My stomach tightened instantly. There it was. The question I'd spent 20 years outrunning. Around us, the party noises faded into uneasy silence, because the truth was, Kandahar wasn't the reason I vanished. It was what happened after. The air changed after Walter asked that question. Even the breeze across Aunt Donna's patio seemed to slow down. Why did you disappear after Kandahar? Nobody touched their food anymore. Rick lowered his beer. My younger cousins looked confused and uncomfortable, like they were suddenly realizing the strange older woman at family cookouts had lived an entire life. None of them understood. I stared out across the dark Texas fields for several long seconds before answering. Because some things follow you home, I said quietly. Walter's face tightened. He already knew, at least part of it. But my family didn't. And once certain stories are spoken out loud, you can't put them back into silence. I folded my hands together slowly. Kandahar wasn't supposed to become a rescue mission, I began. The memories came back sharper than I wanted. Funny how trauma works. You can forget birthdays, phone numbers, names. But fear stays preserved like glass. It started as a routine extraction support operation, I continued. Small recon unit, in and out before sunrise. Walter nodded once. The sandstorm hit early, he added quietly. Yeah. I could still remember the sky turning orange-black over Afghanistan. One moment visibility was manageable. The next moment it looked like the world itself was collapsing. We lost communications twice, I said. Then the recon team got ambushed moving toward the extraction point. Rick shifted in his chair. What kind of ambush? The kind where people stop coming home. That shut him up again. I leaned back slowly. The enemy already knew where they were headed. Heavy gunfire, RPGs, 2 men down immediately. Aunt Donna pressed a hand against her chest. Oh my lord. I kept going because stopping would have been worse. The command channel ordered all air units to withdraw. Walter looked down at the table. Nobody liked that part. Especially veterans. Because sometimes war isn't about bravery. Sometimes it's about watching institutions protect themselves first. The storm was getting worse, I continued. One pilot turned back. Then another. And you didn't, Walter said softly. I shook my head. No. Rick frowned. Why not? I looked directly at him. Because they were still alive. Simple as that. The room stayed quiet. Older Americans understand something younger people often don't. When you've lived long enough, the plain truths usually hit the hardest. I closed my eyes briefly. I remember hearing one of the SEALs over the radio, I said. Could barely understand him through the static. Walter's jaw tightened. He was praying, he muttered. Yeah. I swallowed carefully. He thought nobody was coming. The patio had become so silent I could hear insects humming beyond the fence line. I flew blind for most of the final approach, I said. Couldn't see terrain, couldn't see enemy movement, could barely see my own instrument panel. Rick looked genuinely unsettled now. And you still landed. Hardest landing of my life. The old memories moved through me again. Rotor vibration, dust choking the cockpit, warning alarms screaming. Then the gunfire. God, the gunfire. Bullets tore through the left side before we even touched ground, I said quietly. Aunt Donna covered her mouth. Walter looked exhausted just hearing it again. The SEAL team was already carrying wounded when I landed, I continued. One man missing part of his leg, another barely conscious. Rick whispered Jesus. I ignored the sympathy in his voice. I wasn't interested in sympathy anymore. Not after all these years. We loaded everybody we could, I said. Then another RPG hit nearby. Walter nodded grimly. That's when the fire started. Yeah. The smell returned instantly in my mind. Burning hydraulic fluid. Burned metal. Burned flesh. Some smells never leave you. Rick stared at me differently now. Not mockingly. Not confidently. Just uncertain. So how'd you get out? I almost smiled. That's the part people usually call heroic. Walter looked at me carefully. But you don't. No. I rubbed my thumb slowly across an old scar on my palm. Heroic means you had choices, I said. Most of us didn't. The truth settled heavily over the patio. I continued quietly. We lifted off overloaded and half-blind in the middle of the storm. Walter added softly, with enemy vehicles closing in. Yeah. A younger cousin near the patio door whispered, "This sounds like a movie." I shook my head immediately. No, I said firmly, movies end clean. That line stayed hanging in the warm night air. Because this part wasn't clean. Not even close. The mission report blamed mechanical failure, I said eventually. Rick frowned. But that wasn't true. No. Walter exhaled slowly through his nose. Here it came. The ugliest part. The commanding officer in charge of the operation panicked, I said quietly. He ordered everybody to retreat before the ground team was secured. Aunt Donna looked confused. But if they left, those soldiers would have died. They almost did. Walter's voice turned cold. He abandoned them. I nodded once. But after we got back, politics started. Rick blinked. Politics. I laughed softly without humor. Military careers, public image, command reputation. The bitterness in my own voice surprised me. Maybe because I spent years pretending it was gone. The officer responsible had powerful connections, I continued. And somebody needed to absorb the blame for the operation falling apart. Rick stared at me. You. Me. Nobody moved. Nobody even touched their drinks. They said I acted recklessly, I said. Said I violated withdrawal orders. Said I endangered military assets. Walter slammed his palm softly against the table. You saved lives. Didn't matter. The old SEAL shook his head with visible anger. I tried fighting it. I know. But the brass buried everything. Yeah. The bitterness in Walter's eyes told me he'd carried this anger almost as long as I had. Rick spoke carefully now. So they punished you for rescuing people? I looked at him calmly. No, I said. They punished me for embarrassing somebody important. That hit him harder than the war stories. Because Americans over a certain age understand institutions, understand pride, understand cowardice wearing expensive uniforms. I leaned back slowly. After that, things collapsed fast. My throat tightened slightly. My marriage fell apart. I couldn't sleep, couldn't be around crowds. Every helicopter sound sent my heart racing. Walter lowered his eyes. I heard about the divorce. Yeah. I gave a faint shrug. He said the war got more of me than he ever had. Nobody knew how to respond to that. Because what do you say? Some losses happen slowly. Quietly. Like rust. Rick looked down at his beer for a long moment before finally speaking. So all these years. I finished the sentence for him. You thought I was just some weird old woman who hated family parties. His face flushed slightly. I mean, kinda. I actually smiled a little. At least you're honest. The tension loosened for one brief second. Then Walter spoke again. And the warmth vanished immediately. The officer who buried the truth, he said quietly. He's here in Texas tomorrow. My stomach dropped. I already knew the name before he said it. Daniel Mercer, Walter muttered darkly. Retired general now. I stared at him. Walter's expression hardened. He's the guest speaker at the Veterans Fundraiser in Austin tomorrow night. The old memories turned cold inside my chest. Because after 20 years, the man who destroyed my life was suddenly 1 hour down the highway. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was afraid of seeing Daniel Mercer again. At my age, fear changes shape. When you're young, you fear bullets and failure and embarrassment. When you're older, you fear memories. I spent most of the night sitting on the back porch of my small house outside Temple, Texas, listening to crickets and staring into darkness while old sounds returned. Rotor blades, radio static, men screaming coordinates through gunfire. By morning, my chest already felt tired. At around 10, Walter Briggs called. You going tonight, he asked. No. You should. I spent 20 years avoiding men like Mercer. Walter was quiet for a second. Claire, he said carefully, sometimes avoiding pain also means avoiding closure. I hated when old veterans got philosophical before noon. I'm not looking for closure. What are you looking for? That question lingered longer than I expected. Finally, I answered honestly. Peace. Walter sighed softly. Then maybe it's time. By 6:30 that evening, I was standing outside the Austin Veterans Memorial Center wondering why I'd ignored my own instincts. The parking lot was full. Luxury SUVs, pickup trucks, American flags mounted near the entrance. Inside, donors and retired officers mingled beneath warm chandelier lighting, while waiters carried trays of wine and shrimp cocktails. The room smelled like expensive cologne and polished wood, the kind of place where people honored sacrifice comfortably. Walter met me near the entrance. You came, still deciding if that was smart. He gave me a faint smile. You look nervous. I'm considering assaulting an elderly general. That actually made him laugh. For a moment I almost relaxed. Then I saw Daniel Mercer, and suddenly it felt like Afghanistan had reached through 20 years to grab me by the throat. Mercer stood near the ballroom stage surrounded by donors and local politicians. Tall, silver-haired, perfect posture, the kind of man America trusted instantly. He wore confidence like another military decoration. People shook his hand constantly. Veterans thanked him for his service. A younger reporter hovered nearby with a camera crew. Walter noticed my expression. You okay? No. Mercer turned slightly while laughing at something someone said. Then he saw me. His smile disappeared immediately. Not confusion. Recognition. Instant recognition. And underneath it, fear. Tiny, fast, but real. The general excused himself from the group and slowly walked toward us. Walter straightened beside me automatically. Old instincts. Mercer stopped a few feet away. Claire Donovan, he said calmly. His voice sounded exactly the same. That bothered me more than it should have. General Mercer. The title tasted bitter. His eyes scanned me carefully. You look well. That makes one of us. Walter coughed softly to hide a laugh. Mercer ignored him. I heard you left Texas years ago. I heard you rewrote history. That landed harder. The air between us tightened immediately. Mercer's polished smile returned, but thinner now. Still angry, I see. I stared directly into his eyes. Still lying, I see. Walter shifted slightly beside me. People nearby had begun noticing the tension. Mercer lowered his voice. This isn't the place. No, I replied softly. You made sure of that 20 years ago. The ballroom lights dimmed shortly afterward as guests moved toward their tables. Walter and I sat near the back. I would have left already if pride hadn't kept me planted in that chair. That's the ugly truth nobody admits. Sometimes revenge begins simply because you're tired of swallowing humiliation. An announcer stepped onto the stage. Tonight, he said warmly, we honor leadership, courage, and lifelong service. Mercer received a standing ovation before he even touched the microphone. I stayed seated. Walter did too. Mercer began speaking smoothly about patriotism and sacrifice. The crowd loved him. Of course they did. Men like Mercer always knew exactly what America wanted to hear, especially older Americans. Duty, honor, country. He spoke beautifully. That was part of the problem. Then his eyes found me again near the back table, and everything changed. There are, Mercer said into the microphone. Unfortunately, some people who never fully adjust after war. Walter stiffened beside me. I already knew where this was going. Mercer continued calmly. Trauma affects judgment, memory, emotional stability. Several people glanced toward our table now. Coward. The old anger inside me stirred awake for the first time in years. Mercer folded his hands behind his back like a statesman. Leadership sometimes requires difficult decisions under pressure. Not everyone understands those realities. Walter muttered, son of a bitch. Mercer was doing it again. Same as before, using polished language to bury truth. The crowd listened respectfully. Most had no idea they were watching a man defend cowardice in real time. Then Mercer smiled faintly. And sadly he added some former personnel build myths around themselves afterward. Walter slammed his hand against the table hard enough to rattle silverware. That turned heads immediately. Mercer looked directly at him, and Walter Briggs stood up. I was there. The room went completely still. Walter's old voice carried farther than I expected. Mercer's expression darkened instantly. Walter, he warned quietly. No, Walter snapped. You've talked long enough. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Nobody moved. Walter pointed toward me. That woman flew into a goddamn firestorm while you ran. The ballroom exploded into whispers. Mercer's face turned pale. You don't know what you're talking about, he said sharply. But now another voice spoke up. I do. A man near the front slowly rose from a wheelchair. Older Marine, gray beard, missing left leg. He looked toward me with wet eyes. She saved my life. Silence swallowed the room again. Then another veteran stood. Then another. A medic. A former ranger. An elderly father holding a folded military cap. One by one they spoke. She brought my son home. She carried wounded men herself. We were told nobody was coming. Mercer's confident posture finally cracked. I sat frozen while 20 years of buried truth rose into the room like smoke. Walter stepped closer to the stage. The Kandahar files were partially declassified last year, he said loudly. People can read them now. Mercer's jaw tightened. Walter's voice shook with fury. You abandoned your men. Nobody applauded now. Nobody smiled. The ballroom had become a courtroom. And for the first time in 2 decades, Daniel Mercer looked small. Then the Marine in the wheelchair slowly raised a trembling hand to his forehead and saluted me. The entire room watched in silence, some with shock, some with shame, some with tears. And suddenly I realized something strange. After 20 years, I no longer wanted revenge. I just wanted the truth to stop hiding. The ballroom never fully recovered after that, even after the applause died away, even after people slowly returned to their seats. The mood had changed too much. Truth does that sometimes. Especially old truth. It settles into a room like smoke and makes everybody breathe differently. Daniel Mercer tried finishing his speech, but the confidence was gone now. People still listened politely because Americans over 60 were raised to respect uniforms and ceremony. But you could feel the shift. Once doubt enters a room, reputation starts leaking quietly through the cracks. Mercer wrapped up 10 minutes later to scattered applause. Nothing like the standing ovation from earlier. Walter leaned toward me. You okay? I watched Mercer step away from the podium while avoiding eye contact with half the ballroom. I don't know yet. And that was the truth. I'd spent 20 years imagining what justice would feel like. Turns out, it mostly felt exhausting. The fundraiser ended shortly afterward. Clusters of veterans and donors gathered around the lobby speaking in hushed voices. Several older men approached me carefully. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just quietly. That's how older veterans usually handle respect. One retired ranger shook my hand and said, "Thank you for bringing our boys home." Another man in a Vietnam veteran cap hugged me without saying a word. A woman in her 70s pressed a folded photograph into my hand. "My son talked about you before he died," she whispered. I looked down at the picture. Young Marine, big smile, desert camouflage. My chest tightened immediately. "Oh," I whispered softly, "I remember him." And I did. That was the burden nobody explains about surviving war. You carry faces forever. The woman squeezed my hand gently. "He said you stayed calm when everybody else panicked." I almost laughed at that. I'd never felt calm once in my entire military career. But soldiers often mistake quiet fear for courage. Walter and I eventually stepped outside into the warm Austin night air. The fundraiser noise faded behind us while traffic moved steadily along the nearby highway. Texas nights always smell faintly like dust and gasoline in summer. Walter lit a cigarette despite probably being told not to by 6 different doctors. "You know this is gonna spread fast," he said. I figured. The veteran community never forgets names. I leaned against the concrete railing outside the building. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "I spent 20 years trying to disappear." Walter gave a tired smile. "And one barbecue ruined it." That actually made me laugh for real. The first real laugh in a long time. Then Walter grew serious again. "You deserved better, Claire." I stared out toward the parking lot lights. Maybe once years ago hearing that would have mattered more. But age changes your relationship with fairness. At some point you realize life rarely balances the books cleanly. "You know what I regret most?" I asked quietly. Walter shook his head. "I let bitterness isolate me." The old SEAL didn't answer immediately, because he understood. Veterans are very good at isolation. We build entire lives around avoiding pain. And after enough years, loneliness starts feeling normal. By the next morning, the story had already started moving through military circles online. Walter wasn't kidding. Calls came all day. Old pilots, former medics, retired officers. People I hadn't spoken to in decades somehow found my number within hours. One man cried on the phone before saying a single word. Another simply said, "Thought you should know." We never believed the official story. That one hit harder than I expected. Because deep down I think part of me always believed I'd truly been abandoned by everybody. Turns out silence and betrayal aren't always the same thing. Around noon, Rick showed up at my house unexpectedly. I saw his truck pull into the driveway while I was watering tomato plants. He climbed out awkwardly, holding a paper bag from a local bakery. That alone told me he was nervous. Rick normally apologized with jokes, not pastries. I set the hose down. What's in the bag? Peach turnovers. I nodded slowly. That's serious, huh? He rubbed the back of his neck. Can I come in? We sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee while the ceiling fan hummed overhead. Rick looked uncomfortable in the way middle-aged men do when they realize they've behaved badly. Finally he sighed. I owe you an apology. You do? He nodded. I was an ass. Also true. That earned a weak smile. Then his face turned serious again. I really thought you were exaggerating at the barbecue. I know. No, he said quietly. I thought you were lonely. That surprised me. Rick stared down into his coffee. You always stayed away from people, he admitted. I figured maybe you wanted attention. I leaned back slowly. That's fair. No, he said immediately. It isn't. The sincerity in his voice softened something inside me. Rick looked around my small kitchen. You've been carrying all this alone. I gave a small shrug. For a while. He shook his head slowly. That general... He paused. How does somebody live with doing that to another person? I thought about Daniel Mercer standing on that stage pretending to be honorable. Then I answered honestly. Probably the same way the rest of us survive hard things. Rick frowned. How? By lying to ourselves carefully. 3 days later, Mercer called me personally. I almost didn't answer. But curiosity won. His voice sounded older now. Not physically older. Spiritually older? Claire, he said quietly, could we meet? Every instinct told me no. But another part of me, the tired part, wanted the story finished properly. So we met at a small diner outside Georgetown. Nothing dramatic. Just coffee and silence. Mercer looked terrible. The polished confidence was gone. Without the podium and medals, he suddenly seemed like what he truly was, an aging man carrying decades of shame. He stared at his untouched coffee for a long time before speaking. I was afraid he admitted. I said nothing. The storm hit, communications collapsed, and I panicked. There it was. Not strategy, not politics. Cowardice. Simple human cowardice. His eyes looked wet now. I kept telling myself withdrawing was tactical. He swallowed hard. But the truth is, I was terrified. I watched him carefully. This was the man I'd hated for 20 years, and suddenly he just looked tired. Broken even. Mercer rubbed his trembling hands together. You want to know something awful? I stayed silent. I hated you, he whispered. Because every time someone mentioned your name, I remembered exactly who I really was. The diner grew quiet around us. Older couples drank coffee nearby. Country music played softly overhead. Ordinary American life continuing around two damaged people. Mercer finally looked up at me. After everything I did, he asked hoarsely, why didn't you destroy me years ago? I stared at him for a very long time before answering. Because the truth was, I'd spent 20 years asking myself the exact same question. Daniel Mercer sat across from me in that little diner looking like a man who had finally run out of places to hide. Outside the windows, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the highway while pickup trucks rolled past in steady Texas traffic. Inside, a waitress refilled coffee cups and called everybody honey. Ordinary life. That's the strange thing about heavy moments. The world never pauses for them. Mercer waited for my answer. Why didn't you destroy me years ago? I looked down at my coffee for a long moment before speaking. Because hatred gets heavy, I said quietly. He blinked slowly. You carry it long enough. Eventually it carries you. The old general lowered his eyes, and for the first time since I'd known him, Daniel Mercer looked completely honest. Not polished, not commanding. Just tired. I told myself I was protecting careers, he admitted softly. Protecting the military. Protecting morale. I nodded once. That's how people survive guilt. They rename it. Mercer swallowed hard. I ruined your life. For years, hearing those words was all I thought I wanted. Some admission, some apology, some recognition. But sitting there across from him, I realized something important. Pain doesn't disappear just because somebody finally admits they caused it. It still happened. The lost years still existed. The nightmares still existed. The divorce papers, the panic attacks, the isolation, none of that magically vanished. But strangely, the anger had already started fading before this conversation even began. Mercer rubbed his hands together slowly. I don't expect forgiveness. That's good, I replied calmly, because forgiveness isn't a transaction. He nodded faintly. Then we sat quietly for a while, listening to dishes clatter behind the counter. Two old people carrying different kinds of regret. A week later, Walter invited me to a veterans support gathering in Killeen. Small room, nothing fancy. Just folding chairs, coffee, and older veterans trying to help younger ones stay afloat after service. Normally, I would have refused. For years I avoided veteran events whenever possible. Too many ghosts in one room? But this time felt different. Maybe because something inside me had finally loosened. Maybe because after spending decades hiding from my past, I was getting tired of running from it. Walter introduced me simply. "This is Claire." No dramatic speech, no medals, no war stories. Just Claire. And honestly, I appreciated that more than he probably realized. The group included young soldiers recently back from overseas, a few older Vietnam vets, one Marine missing 2 fingers, another man who barely spoke the entire evening. I recognized that silence immediately. Trauma has a sound, and sometimes the sound is nothing at all. Walter eventually asked if I'd share something. At first I didn't want to. Then I noticed one younger veteran sitting near the wall staring down at the floor exactly the way I used to after Afghanistan. That look changed my mind, so I stood slowly and spoke. "You know, I began quietly. People hear military stories and think the hardest part is combat." Several veterans nodded slightly. "But for a lot of us," I continued, "the hardest part comes afterward." The room stayed completely still. I spoke slowly, carefully, not like a speech, more like a confession. "You come home and everybody expects you to return to normal immediately." A few bitter laughs moved through the room. "But war changes the speed of your thinking," I said. "Changes how you sleep, changes how safe the world feels." The younger veteran near the wall finally looked up at me. For years I admitted I thought isolation was strength. Walter watched quietly from the back. "I thought shutting people out protected me." I smiled faintly. "But loneliness is sneaky. It starts feeling comfortable after a while." Several older veterans nodded hard at that one. Because they knew. God, they knew. One man finally raised his hand. Gray-haired Army veteran, probably early 70s. "Can I ask something?" "Sure." He hesitated. "Why'd they call you Hades?" A few people in the room shifted curiously. I looked down at my hands before answering. For years, people assumed the call sign meant something dark, dangerous, violent. But the truth was never what they expected. The first team that gave me the name, I said softly, used it after a rescue mission went bad. The room stayed silent. I smiled gently. One of the SEALs said, I paused briefly, "No matter how deep into hell we got, she always came back for us." Nobody spoke afterward. Not immediately. Because older Americans understand something younger audiences sometimes miss. The most meaningful moments usually arrive quietly. No music, no explosions. Just truth landing softly inside a room. After the meeting ended, several younger veterans stayed behind, talking longer than they probably intended. One thanked me for speaking honestly about isolation. Another admitted he hadn't talked to his own daughter in 8 months. That one hurt to hear. Before leaving, the quiet young veteran from earlier finally approached me near the coffee table. He looked nervous. "You really think people can come back from that stuff?" he asked. "From what?" He shrugged helplessly. "The darkness." I studied him carefully. Then I answered the only honest way I knew how. "Not completely," I said, "but enough to live again." His eyes watered slightly. He nodded once. And somehow, that moment mattered more to me than every medal I'd ever received. That evening I drove home alone beneath a deep orange Texas sunset. Windows down, warm air rolling through the truck. For the first time in years, the silence around me didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. I thought about Aunt Donna, Walter, Rick, even Daniel Mercer. Life had wounded all of us differently. Some people responded with arrogance, some with guilt, some with isolation. But underneath it all, most people were simply trying to survive themselves. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the truck a little longer, watching evening light settle across the fields. And I realized something. People thought Hades meant death, fear, violence. But they were wrong. It meant bringing people back from hell, including yourself. And maybe that's true for more people than we realize. Maybe some of us spend years carrying pain silently because we think nobody else would understand. Maybe pride keeps families apart longer than it should. Maybe forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened, but finally refusing to let bitterness become your final identity. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone you lost, someone you forgave, or even a part of yourself you're still trying to heal, then I hope you'll carry that feeling forward. Share it with somebody who might need it. And remember, sometimes the strongest people aren't the loudest ones in the room. Sometimes they're simply the ones who survived and chose kindness anyway. I still remember the sound of the crystal glass hitting the marble floor. The room had gone completely silent. One moment I was carrying a tray of sparkling water through a crowded charity ballroom. The next, one of the most powerful men in Europe was staring at my wrist as if he'd seen a ghost. The king's glass slipped from his hand. It shattered at his feet. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. His eyes never left the pale crescent-shaped scar on my wrist. Then he looked directly at me. His face had turned almost white. "That scar," he whispered. The room seemed to disappear around us. "What is your full name?" At that moment I had no idea that everything I believed about my life was about to change. I had no idea that the people who spent 30 years calling me their burden had built their entire lives on a lie. And I certainly had no idea that the answer I gave that night would eventually destroy the reputation of the family that raised me. "My name is Emma Carter," or at least that's what I believed for most of my life. For 30 years I was known as the black sheep of the Carter family. The strange thing was everyone in town believed I should have been grateful. The Carters had a reputation for being good people, church-going people, community-minded people, the kind of people who volunteered at pancake breakfasts and donated canned goods during the holidays. Whenever someone talked about me, my adoptive mother Diane would smile sadly and say the same thing. "We rescued Emma when she was just a baby." People always nodded. They always praised her. They always told her what a wonderful woman she was. What nobody ever asked was what happened after the rescue. Because being rescued and being loved are two very different things. I grew up in a small town outside Springfield, Illinois. The Carter house sat on a few acres of land surrounded by cornfields and old oak trees. From the outside, it looked like the perfect family home. Inside, things were different. Frank and Diane Carter had 2 biological children. Michael was 3 years older than me. Rebecca was 2 years younger. They had nice bedrooms. They got new clothes for school. They went on vacations. They received birthday parties with balloons and presents. I received responsibilities. By the time I was 10 years old, I was making breakfasts before school. At 12, I was doing laundry for 5 people. At 14, I was cleaning bathrooms, mowing lawns, and helping in the family hardware store after class. Whenever I complained, Diane had a ready answer. "You should be thankful." "For what?" I once asked. She looked shocked. "For everything." I wanted to ask what everything actually meant. Instead, I stayed quiet. That became a habit, staying quiet. The older I got, the clearer the differences became. When Michael turned 16, he got a used pickup truck. When I turned 16, I got a list of additional chores. When Rebecca wanted to attend a summer arts program, my parents paid thousands of dollars. When I asked about community college courses, Frank laughed. Somebody has to help around here. I understood what he meant. That somebody was me. I wasn't treated like a daughter. I was treated like an obligation, a responsibility, a debt that could never be repaid. The worst part wasn't the work. Looking back, I don't mind hard work. The worst part was hearing the same story over and over. "We saved you." Every family gathering, every church picnic, every holiday dinner, someone would eventually bring up my adoption. And Diane would tell the story, how they had taken in a helpless baby, how generous they had been, how lucky I was. People would smile at me. Some would even say things like, "You hit the jackpot." I always smiled back. It seemed easier than explaining the truth. The truth was that I slept in a converted laundry room until I was 22 years old. The truth was that every paycheck from the hardware store somehow ended up helping with family expenses. The truth was that I often felt more like hired help than family. But I never left. Partly because I had nowhere to go. Partly because I still hoped things might change. And partly because there was one person who convinced me I mattered. My grandmother. Not Frank's mother. Diane's mother. Her name was Margaret. She lived in a small cottage behind the main house. As she got older, I spent more and more time helping care for her. Unlike everyone else, she never treated me differently. She listened. She asked about my dreams. She remembered my birthday. One afternoon when I was 24, she held my hand and looked at me with tears in her eyes. "You've always deserved better." I laughed softly. "Better than what?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the main house. Then back at me. "Just remember something." "What?" "Sometimes the people who tell you who you are have the least right to define you." At the time, I didn't understand. Years later, those words would come back to me. Again and again. Margaret passed away when I was 26. After that, the house felt colder, lonelier. Michael moved to Chicago. Rebecca got married. Yet somehow I remained, helping, cleaning, working, existing on the edges of everyone else's lives. By the time I turned 30, I had stopped expecting fairness. I volunteered at local charities because helping others gave me a sense of purpose. It reminded me that kindness still existed, that there were good people in the world. I certainly wasn't expecting anything extraordinary to happen. I wasn't looking for answers. I wasn't searching for my past. I was simply trying to build a meaningful life despite everything. Then an invitation arrived for a major charity gala being held in Chicago. An international humanitarian event. Hundreds of guests, political leaders, business executives, and one very special visitor, a European king. I signed up to volunteer without giving it much thought. I had no idea that a single evening would unravel 30 years of lies, or that the small crescent-shaped scar on my wrist, something I had carried since infancy, would become the key to a secret nobody had told me. A secret powerful enough to change everything, including the family that claimed they had rescued me. The charity gala took place on a cool October evening in downtown Chicago. I almost didn't go. Looking back now, that still amazes me. One small decision, one ordinary choice, and an entire lifetime changed direction. The event was being held at a historic hotel overlooking the Chicago River. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and polished marble floors. Everywhere I looked, people were dressed in expensive suits and elegant gowns. I felt completely out of place. Most of the volunteers did. We spent the afternoon setting tables, arranging place cards, and preparing serving stations. I remember standing near a large window as the sun began to set over the city skyline. One of the other volunteers smiled at me. "Nervous? A little." "Me too," she laughed. "Don't worry, just carry the trays and smile." That sounded simple enough. For most of my life, I'd been carrying things for other people. A tray wasn't going to intimidate me. Still, there was something strange in the air that evening. A feeling I couldn't quite explain. As guests began arriving, the ballroom filled with conversation and laughter. Television crews stood near the entrance. Security personnel quietly monitored the room. Everyone was waiting for the guest of honor, King Alexander, the constitutional monarch of a small European nation called Ashford. Most Americans had never heard much about the country, but the king was well known for his humanitarian work. He had spent decades supporting children's hospitals' education programs and disaster relief efforts. At 78 years old, he was widely respected, especially among older Americans. To me, he was simply another important guest. Nothing more. I certainly never imagined our lives had any connection whatsoever. The evening proceeded smoothly. I carried water glasses, refilled coffee cups, cleared empty plates. It was familiar work, comfortable work, the kind of work I had done my entire life. Around 9 o'clock, King Alexander arrived. The room immediately stood. Applause echoed throughout the ballroom. I glanced toward the entrance. He looked older than he appeared on television. Not weak, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying responsibilities for a very long time. For some reason, I found that comforting. The event continued. Speeches were delivered. Awards were presented. Donations were announced. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Until it wasn't. I was carrying a tray of sparkling water toward the king's table. One of the guests accidentally stepped backward. I adjusted my balance to avoid colliding with him. As I reached forward, my sleeve slid several inches up my arm, exposing the scar. The scar had been with me my entire life, a pale crescent-shaped mark on my left wrist. I rarely thought about it. Nobody ever had, at least not until that moment. The king's eyes locked onto it immediately. I still remember the expression on his face. Confusion, recognition, fear, all appearing within the span of a few seconds. Then came the crash. His crystal glass slipped from his fingers. It struck the marble floor. The sound echoed throughout the ballroom. Every conversation stopped. I froze. Everyone froze. The king slowly rose from his chair. His eyes never left my wrist. I suddenly became aware of hundreds of people staring at me. My heart began pounding. Had I done something wrong? Was there food on my uniform? What was happening? The king took several steps forward. Security moved instinctively. He lifted a hand. They stopped. The entire ballroom remained silent. Then he spoke. That scar. His voice sounded almost fragile. Not like a king. Not like a public figure. Like a man seeing something impossible. He looked directly into my eyes. "What is your full name?" I swallowed. "Emma Carter." His expression changed. "No." He shook his head. "That can't be right." The room felt strangely distant. I could hear my heartbeat. Nothing else. The king stared at me for several long seconds. Then he asked another question. "How old are you?" 30. The color drained from his face. A woman seated beside him suddenly gripped the edge of the table. She looked equally shocked. The king's chief advisor approached cautiously. "Your Majesty." The king ignored him. Instead, he asked me one final question. "Have you had that scar since birth?" I blinked. "Yes." The answer came automatically. It was something I had been told my entire life. The scar had always been there. The king closed his eyes. For a moment he looked overwhelmed, almost emotional. Then he opened them again. "Miss Carter," he said softly, "I would like to speak with you privately." The room erupted into whispers. Reporters immediately began taking photographs. Security escorted me to a private conference room upstairs. I felt completely numb. Nothing made sense. Inside the room sat the king, his advisor, 2 attorneys, and several security officials. I suddenly wished I were back home cleaning dishes. At least that world made sense. This one didn't. The king sat across from me. For several moments he simply studied my face. Finally he spoke. "Emma, do you know anything about your biological parents?" I shook my head. "No, nothing at all." My adoptive parents always said they didn't know much. The king's jaw tightened slightly. His advisors exchanged glances. Something passed silently between them. Something important. I noticed immediately. "What's going on?" I asked. Nobody answered right away. Finally, the king leaned forward. "There was a child." His voice was careful, measured. "A little girl?" I felt a chill run through me. 30 years ago. The room became very quiet. She disappeared during a period of political violence in my country. I stared at him, unsure where this conversation was going. "The child was never found." My pulse quickened. The king looked directly at my wrist, then back at me. "That scar was documented in confidential medical records." I couldn't breathe. Not properly. Surely this was impossible. Surely this had to be some mistake. The king seemed to read my thoughts. "At this moment, Emma, I do not know what the truth is." He paused. "But I believe there is a possibility. A possibility of what?" The words barely escaped my mouth. The king took a long breath. Then he said the sentence that shattered everything I thought I knew. "I believe you may not be Emma Carter at all." The room fell silent again. And for the first time in my life, I realized that the biggest lie might not have been how the Carters treated me. The biggest lie might have been who I was. I barely slept that night. After leaving the hotel, I sat alone in my room staring out at the lights of downtown Chicago until sunrise. Every few minutes I replayed the conversation in my head. The king's face, his questions, the look of shock when he saw my scar. Most of all, the sentence that refused to leave me alone. "I believe you may not be Emma Carter at all." It sounded ridiculous. Impossible. Yet something deep inside me kept returning to it. Because if there was one thing I had learned growing up, it was this. The truth often hides inside things that don't make sense. The following morning I received a phone call. It was one of the king's legal advisors. His voice was polite and professional. "Miss Carter, His Majesty would like to request your cooperation." "With what?" "A formal investigation." I laughed nervously. "An investigation into me?" "Into your history." The word history hit me harder than I expected. Because the truth was, I didn't really have one. At least not before the Carters. There were no baby photos from the hospital. No stories about my first steps. No details about where I came from. Whenever I had asked growing up, Diane always gave the same answer. "You were abandoned." That was usually the end of the conversation. Sometimes she added, "We took you when nobody else wanted you." As a child, I believed her. As an adult, I stopped asking. Now, for the first time, I wondered if that had been exactly what she wanted. 3 days later, I agreed to DNA testing. The process itself wasn't dramatic. No grand speeches. No emotional music. Just paperwork signatures and a simple cheek swab. The kind of ordinary procedure that somehow carried the weight of an entire lifetime. While the testing was underway, investigators began gathering information. And almost immediately, strange things started appearing. The first surprise came from adoption records, or rather the lack of them. There was no standard adoption file, no court documentation, no finalized adoption proceedings, no public record explaining how I had entered the Carter household. The investigators were puzzled. So was I. By the second week, more questions emerged. Financial records revealed several unusual deposits made to Frank Carter's bank account during my infancy. Large deposits, much larger than anything his income could explain. The payments had continued for years, regularly, consistently. Then they suddenly stopped. Nobody could explain why, except perhaps the people who had received them. I began to feel sick every time a new discovery appeared. Not because I feared the truth, because I feared what it might reveal about the people I had trusted. One afternoon, I drove back to Springfield. I needed answers. Not from investigators, from Diane. When she opened the front door, she looked surprised to see me. "Emma." I stepped inside. "We need to talk." Her expression immediately hardened. "About what?" I studied her face. For years I had avoided confrontation. Not anymore. Where did I come from? The question hung between us. For a moment I thought I saw fear. Real fear. Then it disappeared. You know where you came from? No. I shook my head. I don't. Diane folded her arms. We adopted you. Show me the papers. Silence. Show me. She looked away. That told me everything. Frank entered from the kitchen. His face darkened immediately. What's going on? I turned toward him. Where are my adoption records? He didn't answer. Neither did Diane. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Frank said something that chilled me. Some things are better left alone. I stared at him. No. My voice trembled slightly. I think that's exactly what's been wrong all these years. I left without another word. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of them. And that frightened them more than anything. 2 weeks later, the DNA results arrived. I was sitting in a private conference room at the Ashford Consulate in Chicago. The king was there, his chief advisor, several attorneys, a genetic specialist. Nobody looked relaxed. That alone told me something. The specialist placed a folder on the table. Then she looked directly at me. Miss Carter. My stomach tightened. The results are conclusive. The room became silent. I could hear the ticking of a wall clock. Nothing else. The specialist opened the folder. Your DNA establishes a direct biological relationship to the Ashford royal family. I stared at her, unable to process the words. The king lowered his head. His eyes filled with emotion. The specialist continued. You are the biological granddaughter of Prince Edward Ashford. Nobody spoke. I couldn't. My mind felt completely blank. Prince Edward. I had learned about him during the investigation. The king's younger brother, a respected humanitarian. A man who had died during a violent political attack 30 years earlier. The attack that had supposedly claimed his infant daughter's life as well. Only now it appeared she had survived. And that infant was me. The king finally spoke. His voice shook slightly. For 30 years. He paused. For 30 years we believed you were dead. Tears filled my eyes before I realized they were there. Not because of the title. Not because of royalty. Because somebody had spent 30 years looking for me. While the people raising me had spent 30 years convincing me nobody wanted me. That realization broke something inside me. The king reached into his jacket pocket. He carefully removed an old photograph. The image showed a young couple holding a baby. My parents. My biological parents. For the first time in my life I saw their faces. My mother's smile. My father's eyes. And something else. The baby in the photograph wore a tiny bandage on her wrist. Exactly where my scar was located. I couldn't stop crying. Neither could the king. Then came the final revelation. The one that transformed heartbreak into betrayal. Investigators had uncovered confidential records from decades earlier. Records showing that a trusted intermediary had secretly placed me with the Carters for protection. The arrangement had been temporary. Financial support had been provided. Instructions had been clear. Keep the child safe. Maintain contact. Prepare for eventual reunification. None of that happened. Instead, the Carters disappeared with me. They kept every payment, ignored every inquiry, and raised me as a burden they publicly claimed to have rescued. The room fell silent once more. For years I had believed I was unwanted. For years I had believed I owed them everything. Now I finally understood the truth. They had never rescued me. I was the one they had stolen. For most of my life I dreamed about being treated fairly. Not rich, not important, not powerful. Just fairly. After the DNA results became public within the royal family, people assumed my life immediately transformed into some kind of fairy tale. It didn't. In many ways, things became harder. Because now I had to confront a painful reality. I hadn't merely been neglected. I had been deliberately deceived. For 30 years. That kind of truth doesn't settle comfortably inside a person. No matter how much evidence exists. A month after the DNA confirmation, I traveled to Ashford for the first time. The royal estate wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a glittering palace filled with luxury, at least not entirely. Much of it felt surprisingly normal. Historic buildings, gardens, offices, libraries, people working ordinary jobs. What struck me most was how many people greeted me with kindness. Not because of my bloodline, because they knew my story. The king personally showed me a collection of family photographs, pictures of my father, my mother, my grandparents, an entire lifetime I had never known. One afternoon we sat together in a quiet study overlooking the estate grounds. The king stared out the window for several moments. Then he spoke softly. "You have every right to be angry." I nodded, because I was more than I had ever admitted. "I keep thinking about all the years." My voice cracked. "The birthdays. The holidays. The people I never met." He nodded slowly. "I think about them too." For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he said something I never forgot. "Justice and revenge often begin in the same place." I looked at him. "But they rarely end in the same place." At the time I wasn't sure what he meant. I would understand later. Back in the United States, investigators continued their work. What they uncovered was even worse than anyone expected. Financial records stretched back decades. Every payment sent for my care had been documented. Every transfer. Every account. Every transaction. The total amount was staggering. The money had been intended for my education, my medical care, my future. Instead, much of it had funded the Carter family's lifestyle. Vehicles, vacations, home renovations, college tuition for Michael and Rebecca. The more investigators uncovered, the angrier I became. Not because of the money, because of the hypocrisy. For years they had told everyone they sacrificed for me. The records proved the opposite. They had profited from me. The story eventually attracted media attention. At first I hated that. Reporters appeared everywhere. Television crews, newspapers, online articles. People wanted interviews. They wanted drama. They wanted scandal. What they didn't understand was that this wasn't entertainment. It was my life. Still, once the facts emerged, public opinion shifted quickly. The Carters had spent decades building a reputation as generous adoptive parents. That reputation began collapsing almost overnight. Then came the confrontation. The one I had imagined countless times. The one I wasn't sure I was ready for. The king requested a private meeting. The Carters were invited. So were attorneys, investigators, and several witnesses. The meeting took place in Chicago, inside a large conference room. When Frank and Diane entered, they looked nervous. But not defeated. Not yet. Frank still carried himself with confidence. The same confidence I had seen my entire life. The confidence of a man who believed he could explain away anything. Diane avoided eye contact. Michael and Rebecca were also present. Both looked uncomfortable. The atmosphere felt heavy from the beginning. The investigators began presenting evidence. Bank records, correspondence, financial transfers. Every document told the same story. Payment after payment, year after year. The room grew quieter with each page. Eventually, Frank cleared his throat. "I don't understand why we're being treated like criminals." Nobody responded. He continued. "We raised her." His voice grew stronger. "We fed her. We gave her a home." For a brief moment, I felt something unexpected. Not fear. Not sadness, disappointment. Even now, with the truth sitting directly in front of him, he still couldn't admit what he had done. Then he looked directly at me. "Everything you've become is because of us." The room went silent. The king slowly reached for a folder. He opened it carefully. Inside were decades of records. He began reading. Not dramatically, not angrily, simply reading facts. A payment for educational expenses. Another payment for health care. Another for future savings, another for housing support. Dozens, then hundreds, each one meticulously documented, each one proving the same thing. The support had existed. The opportunities had existed. They simply never reached me. Frank's confidence slowly disappeared. Diane began crying. The king closed the folder. Then he asked a single question. One question that nobody in the room could answer. "If this child was your daughter?" His voice remained calm. "Would you have treated her this way?" Silence. Frank looked down. Diane continued crying. Michael stared at the floor. Rebecca wiped tears from her eyes. Nobody spoke, because there was no defense. No explanation. No excuse. For the first time in my life, the truth stood fully exposed. Not hidden behind family stories. Not disguised by church reputations. Not softened by excuses. Just truth. Simple. Unavoidable. I expected victory to feel satisfying. Instead, I felt tired. Very tired. The anger I had carried for years suddenly felt heavy. Exhausting. As the meeting ended, the Carters quietly left the room. None of them looked at me. Not even once. The investigators gathered their files. The attorneys discussed next steps. The king placed a hand on my shoulder. "You deserved better," I nodded. For years, hearing those words would have brought comfort. Now they brought something else. A question. What was I supposed to do with the rest of my life? The truth had finally come out. The people who hurt me had been exposed. The world now knew what had happened. But justice, I was beginning to learn, doesn't automatically heal old wounds. Sometimes it simply creates space for a different question. What comes next? For several weeks after the confrontation, I barely spoke to anyone. Not because I was hiding, not because I was ashamed. I simply needed time. For 30 years, my identity had been built around survival. Every decision I made had been shaped by the Carter family. Every expectation, every limitation, every wound. Now suddenly all of that had been stripped away. The truth had been exposed. The lies had been revealed. And yet every morning I still woke up feeling like the same woman who had spent years cleaning bathrooms before sunrise. The world saw a lost royal heir. I still saw Emma, the woman who had folded laundry, served church dinners, taken care of elderly neighbors. And somehow I wasn't sure which version was supposed to come next. One morning I sat on a bench overlooking Lake Michigan. The wind coming off the water carried the chill of early November. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely alone. Not lonely, just alone with my thoughts. A text message appeared on my phone. It was from Rebecca, my adoptive sister, the same sister who had spent years enjoying privileges I never received. The message was short. "Can we talk?" I stared at it for several minutes, then put my phone away. I wasn't ready. Over the next few days, more messages arrived. Rebecca again, then Michael, then even Diane. Each message sounded different. Some apologized. Some tried to explain. Some simply asked for a chance to speak. For years I had imagined this moment. The day they would finally acknowledge what happened. The day they would admit the truth. Strangely, it didn't feel satisfying. If anything, it felt sad. Because no apology could give me back 30 years. No explanation could restore birthdays that never happened. No amount of regret could replace the family I never knew. Around that time, the King's legal team met with me. There were options. Many options. Civil lawsuits. Financial claims. Property recovery. Damages. Compensation. The evidence against the Carters was overwhelming. Legally speaking, I could have pursued almost anything. One attorney leaned forward and said carefully, "You have a very strong case." I nodded. Everyone kept talking about winning. But something inside me resisted. Not because they didn't deserve consequences, they absolutely did. The consequences had already begun. Their reputation was destroyed. Their actions were public knowledge. Their carefully crafted image had collapsed. What troubled me was something else. I wasn't sure I wanted the rest of my life to be defined by revenge. That realization surprised me. It also frightened me, because anger had become familiar. For years it had quietly fueled me. Now I wasn't certain I wanted to carry it anymore. A few days later, I received an invitation from the king. When I arrived at the estate, he was walking through one of the gardens. We spent nearly an hour strolling among bare trees and stone pathways. Eventually, he asked a question. "What do you want?" I laughed softly. No one has ever asked me that. I'm asking now. I considered the question carefully. What did I want? Money, recognition, status, titles. The answer came faster than I expected. I want peace. The king smiled. I thought you might. We continued walking. Then he said something that stayed with me. Many people spend their lives believing revenge will heal them. I looked at him. Does it? He shook his head. It satisfies. He paused. But healing is something different. That evening I thought about Margaret, the grandmother who had shown me kindness when nobody else did. I remembered her words. Sometimes the people who tell you who you are have the least right to define you. For years the Carters had defined me. The black sheep. The burden. The rescued child. The servant. The outsider. The unwanted girl. But what if I stopped accepting their definitions? What if I stopped letting them determine who I became? The answer felt strangely liberating. A week later, I agreed to meet Rebecca. We met at a small coffee shop in Springfield. Neither of us knew how to begin. For several minutes, we simply sat in silence. Finally, Rebecca spoke. I was jealous of you. I blinked. That wasn't what I expected. Jealous? She nodded. You were stronger than all of us. I almost laughed. She continued. You survived things that would have broken me. Tears filled her eyes. I saw how they treated you. Her voice cracked. And I never said anything. For the first time, I saw genuine regret. Not excuses. Not self-defense. Regret. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Not everything was resolved. Not even close. But something important happened. The truth was finally spoken aloud. A few days later, I met Michael. That conversation was harder. He struggled to accept responsibility. He made excuses. Deflected blame. Avoided difficult truths. Yet even he eventually admitted something. We should have helped you. Simple words, long overdue, but honest. As Thanksgiving approached, I found myself thinking less about revenge and more about legacy. What would I do with this second chance? What would I build? Who would I become? Because for the first time in my life, the future wasn't being decided by someone else. It belonged to me, and I was finally beginning to understand that true victory wasn't making the people who hurt me suffer. True victory was refusing to become like them. The first Christmas after everything came to light felt different. Not because my problems had disappeared, not because every wound had healed, but because for the first time in my life I wasn't carrying someone else's version of my story. I was carrying my own. The holidays had always been difficult for me. Growing up in the Carter household, Christmas was a reminder of where I stood. Michael and Rebecca opened stacks of gifts. I usually received practical items, work gloves, cleaning supplies, sometimes a sweater. Never anything chosen with much thought. I learned early not to expect too much. Now, sitting beside a fireplace at the Ashford estate, I found myself thinking about those years. The difference wasn't the surroundings. It wasn't the history. It wasn't even the fact that I had discovered my biological family. The difference was belonging. For the first time, I understood what that felt like. Not because of blood, because of acceptance. Over the next several months, life slowly settled into a new rhythm. I divided my time between the United States and Ashford. The king never pressured me to embrace titles or ceremonies. In fact, he encouraged the opposite. Live your own life, he often said. That is what your parents would have wanted. Those words meant more to me than he probably realized. For 30 years, other people had made decisions about my future. Now I had the freedom to choose. And I intended to use it well. One of the first things I did was establish a charitable foundation. The idea came from my own experiences. I kept thinking about children who felt invisible. Children who lived in homes where they were tolerated rather than loved. Children who carried burdens they never deserved. The Emma Foundation began with a simple mission: support foster children, support adopted children, support elderly caregivers, support young people aging out of difficult family situations. Nothing extravagant, just practical help, scholarships, counseling, housing assistance, mentorship programs, the kind of support that can change the course of an ordinary life. The response exceeded every expectation. Letters began arriving from all over America. Some came from people in their 70s and 80s. Others came from young adults. Many shared stories that sounded painfully familiar. Stories of rejection. Stories of favoritism. Stories of resilience. Again and again, one message appeared. I thought I was alone. Reading those words always affected me, because for years I had believed the same thing. Meanwhile, the consequences for the Carters continued. Not through revenge. Not through lawsuits. Simply through truth. The public learned what had happened. Their reputation never fully recovered. People who once praised them now viewed them differently. Not with hatred, with disappointment. The hardest consequence wasn't financial. It was moral. They had to live with what they had done. Every day, and unlike me, they couldn't change the past. One afternoon in early spring, I received a phone call. It was Diane. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. Then I answered. Her voice sounded older, much older. Emma. I waited. There was a long silence. Then she began to cry. Not dramatically, not theatrically, quietly, like someone carrying years of regret. I'm sorry. The words came out broken. I know that doesn't fix anything. She paused. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I listened. For once, she wasn't defending herself. She wasn't making excuses. She wasn't reminding me how much she had sacrificed. She was simply telling the truth. Maybe for the first time. We should have loved you better. I closed my eyes. Those 5 words hit harder than anything else she could have said. Because they were true. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then I answered. I know. More silence. Then she whispered, I think about it every day. And for the first time, I believed her. A few weeks later, we met. Not as mother and daughter. Not as enemies. Just as 2 flawed human beings facing an uncomfortable truth. The conversation didn't erase the past. It didn't magically repair everything. Some damage cannot be undone. But something important happened. Responsibility was acknowledged. Truth was accepted. And a small measure of peace became possible. As for forgiveness, people often misunderstand what that means. Forgiveness is not pretending nothing happened. It is not excusing bad behavior. It is not surrendering justice. Forgiveness is choosing not to let bitterness become the final chapter of your story. That was the choice I made. Not for Diane. Not for Frank. For myself. A year after the gala in Chicago, I returned to the same hotel. The ballroom looked exactly as I remembered. The chandeliers, the marble floors, the river beyond the windows. So much had changed. Yet everything looked the same. I stood quietly near the place where the king's glass had shattered. The moment that changed my life. The moment the truth began to emerge. A reporter once asked me what the greatest surprise had been. Discovering royalty. Meeting my biological family. The inheritance. The attention. I gave the same answer I always give. No, the greatest surprise was learning that my worth never depended on what other people believed about me. Not the Carters. Not society. Not even a king. For 30 years I was told I was the black sheep. The unwanted child. The burden. The girl who should be grateful for scraps. But those labels were never mine. They belonged to the people who created them. What belonged to me was something else. My character. My choices. My compassion. My resilience. Those things carried me through long before anyone knew my true identity. And they continue to carry me today. The king once told me something I now understand completely. Blood may reveal who you are, but character reveals who you become. I think that's true. Perhaps more true than anything else in this story. And if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or defined by someone else's judgment, I hope you'll remember that too. Sometimes the people who know your value least speak the loudest. Don't let them write your story. Write it yourself. And if this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on someone in your own life who may need kindness, understanding, or a second chance. Share their burden when you can. Offer encouragement when it's needed. And remember that small acts of compassion often leave the greatest legacy. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for listening. And if stories like this remind you of the strength of the human spirit, I'd be honored if you shared them with others who might need the same reminder. The room went completely silent when the man on the phone said, "Yes, ma'am, we'll move forward under your command." I could feel Daniel's mother's eyes on me, sharp and confused. His father had just set down his fork, the faint clink echoing louder than it should have in that pristine dining room. No one said a word. Not yet. I stood there beside the hallway table, my back straight, my voice steady as I gave a final instruction. "Keep it contained until I get back. I'll review everything personally." "Yes, ma'am." The call ended. When I turned around, every face at that table had changed. And that's when I realized I hadn't planned for what came after. 3 hours earlier, I had stood in front of my closet holding 2 dresses. One was navy blue, tailored, the kind I wore to official functions when I needed to represent more than just myself. The other was older, soft cotton, faded at the seams, something I hadn't worn in years but couldn't quite throw away. I chose the old one. It wasn't a mistake, it was a decision. I slipped it on slowly, smoothing the fabric over my hips, catching my reflection in the mirror. No insignia, no polished shoes, no trace of rank or authority, just a woman in her late 30s with a simple dress and a calm expression. I pulled my hair back into a low, practical style, not the tight regulation bun I wore on base, but something softer, less defined. I left my makeup minimal, almost invisible. When I stepped out into the living room, Daniel looked up from his phone and paused. "You sure about that?" he asked. I smiled lightly. "It's just dinner." He hesitated. That small pause told me everything I needed to know. Daniel loved me. I didn't doubt that. But he also came from a world where appearances mattered. His parents had built a life around status, what you did, how you looked, who you knew. It wasn't cruel exactly. It was just ingrained. I was thinking, I said, slipping on my shoes, I might keep things simple tonight. Simple how? I'll just tell them I work in administration for the army. He blinked. That's not exactly the full picture. No, I said calmly, it isn't. He studied me for a moment, searching my face. Why? I picked up my coat and met his gaze. Because I want to know who they are before they know who I am. That answer didn't sit comfortably with him. I could see it in the way his shoulders shifted. They're good people, he said, just traditional. I'm not trying to trick anyone, I replied. I just don't feel like leading with a title tonight. He nodded slowly, though the doubt didn't leave his eyes entirely. All right. But if it gets weird, I'll handle it. That part at least he believed. The drive to his parents' house took about 40 minutes. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the highway, turning everything gold and quiet. Daniel kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly near mine, though neither of us spoke much. I didn't mind the silence, I used it. In my line of work, you learn to read situations before you step into them. You learn to listen for what isn't said. And tonight, I had a feeling there would be plenty of that. When we pulled into the driveway, I took a moment before opening the door. The house was large but not flashy. Clean lines, well-kept lawn, a place built to signal success without needing to shout it. The kind of home where expectations lived in the walls. Daniel walked around to my side and opened the door for me, a small gesture, polite, practiced. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded, always. His mother opened the door before we even knocked. "Daniel," she said warmly, pulling him into a brief embrace before turning to me. Her smile remained, but it shifted just slightly. "And you must be," she began. "Emily," I said, offering my hand. She took it, her grip light, her eyes scanning me in one quick, efficient glance. Dress, shoes, hair, no judgment spoken aloud, but I'd seen that look before. "Welcome," she said, stepping aside. His father stood in the living room waiting. He didn't move forward immediately. He simply observed as we walked in. "Dad, Daniel said this is Emily." I extended my hand again. "It's nice to meet you, sir." He shook it firmly. "You too." His tone was neutral, controlled. We exchanged a few polite words before moving into the sitting area. The room was arranged carefully, every piece of furniture in its proper place, every surface clean. His mother offered drinks. I accepted water. "So, Emily," she said after a moment, settling into her chair, "Daniel tells us you're in the military." "Yes, ma'am." "What do you do exactly?" There it was, the question. I kept my voice even. I work in administration for the Army. A small pause followed. Not long, just enough. "I see," she said. His father leaned back slightly. "That must be stable work." "It is." He nodded once as if confirming something for himself. The conversation moved on, but the shift had already happened. I felt it in the way his mother's questions changed from curiosity to evaluation, in the way his father stopped asking follow-ups, in the subtle, almost invisible recalibration of expectations. Daniel noticed it too. I saw it in the tightening of his jaw. But he didn't say anything. Not yet. By the time we moved to the dining table, the tone had settled into something quieter, polite, controlled. His mother had prepared a full meal: roast chicken, vegetables, fresh bread. Everything placed just so. We sat. And I waited. Because I had seen this before. Not in homes like this, not exactly. But in rooms where people made decisions based on what they thought you were worth. The only difference was, this time I had chosen to let them. I picked up my fork steady as ever and smiled gently across the table. "Thank you for having me." And somewhere deep inside I knew. This dinner was going to reveal far more than anyone expected. Dinner began the way most formal family dinners do, quietly, with polite conversation and the soft clinking of silverware against porcelain. For a few minutes no one said anything that mattered. Daniel's mother passed the bread basket, her movements smooth and practiced. "Emily, help yourself," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you," I replied, taking a small piece. His father carved the chicken with careful precision, placing portions on each plate, as if it were part of a routine he'd followed for years. There was a rhythm to the table, one that didn't include me yet. I waited. In my experience, people rarely show you who they are in the first 5 minutes. It's what comes after, when comfort sets in, when assumptions take hold, that tells the truth. "So," his mother said, finally settling into her chair, "how long have you been in the Army?" "A little over 15 years, I answered. That was true. She raised her eyebrows slightly. "That's quite a long time for administrative work." "I've moved around a bit," I said. "Different assignments." His father nodded, but there was something behind it. Not approval, not quite skepticism either, just calculation. "And do you plan to stay in that role?" he asked. "For now, yes." Another pause, another shift. Daniel cleared his throat. "Emily's work is more complicated than that, actually." "It's all right," I said gently, placing my hand lightly over his wrist for just a moment. "I'm comfortable with what I do." That quieted him. But it didn't go unnoticed. His mother gave a small, polite smile. Of course. Stability is important, especially for a young couple thinking about the future. There it was again. Not unkind, not openly critical, but layered. I agree, I said simply. She studied me for a second longer than necessary. And your family, are they nearby? No, ma'am, they're back in Ohio. Oh, she said, small town. Yes. That must have been quite an adjustment moving into all this. Her hand gestured lightly around the dining room. It was, I said, but you get used to change. That answer seemed to settle something for her. Across the table, Daniel shifted in his seat. I could feel the tension building, not explosive, just quiet and persistent like pressure behind a closed door. His father took a sip of wine before speaking again. Daniel mentioned you met through mutual friends. Yes, sir. And how long have you been together? Just over a year. He nodded slowly. A year isn't very long. No, I agreed. Another pause. His mother set down her fork. You'll have to forgive us, she said with a soft laugh. We're just protective of our son. I understand, I said. And I did. But understanding didn't mean accepting everything that came with it. Daniel has always been very driven, she continued. We've always encouraged him to aim high. I can see that. And we want to make sure he has a partner who can support that. There it was, said gently, carefully, but clearly. I met her gaze. Support comes in many forms. Her smile tightened just slightly. Of course. Daniel finally spoke up. Mom. It's all right, I said again, calm but firm. I appreciate your honesty. The table fell quiet for a moment. His father leaned back, folding his hands together. In our experience, he said, shared ambition is important in a marriage. I agree, I said. He seemed almost surprised by that. But ambition doesn't always look the same from the outside. That earned me a longer look. What does it look like for you? He asked. I considered the question for a moment. It looks like commitment, I said. Consistency, doing your job well even when no one is watching. That sounds admirable, his mother said, though not particularly visible. I allowed a small smile. Not everything that matters is. Silence again. But this time it felt different. Not just evaluation, but resistance. Halfway through the meal, Daniel's cousin Mark arrived. Late 30s, loud personality, the kind of man who filled a room without trying. Sorry I'm late, he said, dropping into the empty chair beside me. Work ran long. He gave me a quick glance. You must be Emily. Yes. Mark, he said, offering his hand. I've heard a little about you. Only the good parts, I hope. He laughed. Depends who you ask. Within minutes, he had taken over the conversation, steering it toward business investments and career paths. It didn't take long before the topic circled back to me. So, Emily, he said, leaning back in his chair, what do you do again? Administration in the Army. Daniel's mother answered before I could. Mark raised his eyebrows. Ah, paperwork, huh? Among other things, I said. He grinned. Well, someone's got to keep the machine running. I nodded. That's true. He chuckled, clearly amused by his own comment. I always figured the real action was somewhere else. It depends on what you consider action, I replied. He waved it off. Fair enough. But the tone had been set. From that point on, I became background. Not ignored entirely, just placed. Questions shifted away from me. Conversations moved around me. Decisions about what mattered had already been made. Daniel tried once or twice to pull me back in. Emily has a lot of responsibility, actually. But his voice didn't carry the weight it needed to. And I didn't push. Because I was watching, listening, learning. Toward the end of the meal, his mother brought out dessert homemade pie neatly sliced. Emily, she said, setting a plate in front of me, do you cook? Yes, ma'am. What kind of dishes? Mostly simple ones, things I grew up with. She nodded, that's nice. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, Daniel's schedule can be demanding. He'll need someone who can manage a home efficiently. I looked at her steadily. I've managed more complex systems than a household. The words came out before I softened them. A small mistake. Her smile didn't change, but her eyes did. I'm sure you have, she said. But the meaning was clear. Not in the way you think. The plates were cleared, chairs shifted, the evening moved toward its natural close. But the air hadn't eased. If anything, it had settled into something firmer, defined. Daniel walked me toward the hallway while his parents stepped into the kitchen. I'm sorry, he said quietly. For what? They're just like that. I know. You didn't have to. I did, I said gently. He looked at me, searching for something he couldn't quite name. Did what he asked. I held his gaze for a moment. Let them show me who they are. Before he could respond, my phone vibrated in my hand. I glanced down at the screen, and everything shifted. Because I knew that number, and calls like that didn't come without a reason. I took a slow breath. Excuse me, I said, stepping away. As I walked toward the quiet corner of the hallway, I answered the call. Yes. The voice on the other end was urgent but controlled. And in that moment I understood. This dinner was about to become something else entirely. Yes, ma'am, the voice on the other end said. We've got a situation developing. I need your guidance. I stepped a little farther down the hallway, lowering my voice just enough to keep the conversation private, but not so quiet that it sounded secretive. What's the scope, I asked. There was a brief pause, then a clear, concise response. Preliminary reports indicate a containment issue on the south side of the base. Nothing public yet, but it's escalating. Command is asking for direction. I closed my eyes for a second, not in stress, but in focus. This was familiar ground. Controlled pressure, limited time, decisions that mattered. Who's on site, I asked. Colonel Harris is leading initial response. He's waiting on authorization to move resources. Tell him he has it, I said, but keep it contained. No unnecessary exposure. I want a full report within the hour. Yes, ma'am. And keep this off open channels. Understood. The line went quiet for a moment, then returned with a softer tone. We'll handle it. I know you will, I said. The call ended. I stood there for a second longer, letting the shift settle. Then I turned back toward the dining room. The moment I stepped back in, I felt it. Not suspicion, not yet. But attention. Daniel was watching me closely. His parents had resumed their seats, though the conversation hadn't fully picked back up. Everything all right, his mother asked. Yes, ma'am, I said, taking my seat again. Just something from work. She nodded, but there was a new layer in her expression now. Curiosity sharpened. Must be important, Mark added lightly. Sounded serious. Sometimes it is, I replied. He gave a small shrug, clearly not interested in pressing further. But his father was. What exactly do you handle? He asked. There it was again. The question. I folded my hands lightly in my lap. Administrative coordination. He studied me, at this hour. Work doesn't always follow a schedule, I said. That's true, he admitted. But he didn't look convinced. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Like I said, her role's more involved than it sounds. I glanced at him, then back at the table. It's nothing unusual. That answer seemed to close the door for now. But not entirely. Dessert resumed, though the tone had shifted. Subtle, quiet. But different. Mark tapped his fork lightly against his plate. You know, I've always wondered how the military handles stuff like that, late calls, emergencies, all that. It depends on the situation, I said. Seems stressful. It can be. He nodded. I don't think I could do it. I smiled faintly. You'd be surprised what people can handle when they have to. He chuckled. Maybe. But he didn't press further. His mother, however, had gone quiet. She watched me now, not with dismissal, but with calculation. Something didn't fit anymore. And she knew it. After dessert, we moved back into the sitting room. Coffee was served. The evening was supposed to wind down. But instead, it tightened. Daniel sat beside me closer than before. His hand rested lightly near mine, not touching, but present. His father took his usual chair, crossing one leg over the other. So he said after a moment, Daniel tells us you've been considering next steps. I knew what he meant. Yes, sir. Marriage is a serious commitment. I agree. And it requires a certain level of alignment. I met his gaze. In what sense? In lifestyle, expectations, long-term planning. I nodded. Those things matter. And do you feel your current role supports that, he asked? The question wasn't about my job. Not really. It was about value. I answered carefully. I believe I bring stability, discipline, and commitment into any situation I'm part of. His expression didn't change. But I added gently. He leaned forward slightly. But I'm not sure I understand how your position fits into the kind of future Daniel has been building. There it was. Clear, direct. No more soft edges. Daniel shifted beside me. Dad. It's a fair question, I said calmly. He paused, perhaps expecting resistance. Instead, I continued. You're asking whether I meet your expectations. I'm asking whether you're the right partner for my son. I held his gaze. That depends, I said. On what? On whether you're evaluating me based on who I am or what you assume I am. The room went still. Mark let out a quiet breath. Daniel's mother set her cup down carefully. His father's eyes narrowed just slightly. And which do you think it is, he asked. I think I said evenly, you've made a decision without having all the information. He leaned back again. Then perhaps you should provide it. A simple statement, but heavy. Daniel looked at me, his expression caught somewhere between concern and curiosity. He didn't know everything. Not fully. I had told him enough, but not all. Not like this. Not in this room. I could feel the moment building. The line approaching. I had planned to wait. To observe. To leave with quiet conclusions. But plans don't always hold. Not when pressure changes. His mother spoke next, her tone softer but no less pointed. Emily, she said, we don't mean to make you uncomfortable. We just want what's best for Daniel. I understand, I said. And from what we've seen, we're not sure you fully align with that. There it was. Not cruel, but final. A judgment. I took a slow breath. Not out of frustration, but clarity. Because in that moment I knew something important. They weren't bad people. They were just certain. Certain of how the world worked. Certain of what success looked like. Certain of what mattered. And they had placed me outside of that. Without knowing. Without asking. I set my cup down gently. May I ask you something, I said? His father nodded. If I had told you something different earlier about my work, would this conversation be different? He didn't hesitate. Yes. Honest. At least that. And that's exactly why I didn't, I said quietly. The silence that followed was deeper than before. Not tense. Just real. Daniel turned toward me fully now. Emily. I met his eyes briefly. Then I looked back at his parents. There are things about my work that aren't easy to explain in a few sentences, I said, and I didn't feel the need to lead with them tonight. His father folded his hands together. Then perhaps now would be the time. The room waited. Every eye on me. Every assumption hanging in the air. I could have said it plainly. I could have ended the uncertainty in a single sentence. But something held me back. Not hesitation. Not fear. Just timing. Because the truth once spoken doesn't just inform. It changes everything. And I wasn't sure they were ready for that. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated again. Same number. Same urgency. I glanced down. Then back up. Excuse me, I said. I stood stepping away from the room once more. But this time, I knew they were listening. I answered. Yes. The voice came through immediately. Yes, ma'am. Situation is escalating. We need confirmation on next steps now. I didn't lower my voice this time. I didn't step as far away. Proceed with containment, I said clearly. Authorize full response. I'll take command when I arrive. Yes, ma'am. I ended the call. Turned. And walked back into the room. No one spoke. Because now, they had heard enough to know. Something wasn't what it seemed. When I stepped back into the living room, I didn't rush to sit down. For a moment, I simply stood there. Not to make a point, not to create a scene, but because I understood very clearly that the room I had walked out of was not the same one I was walking back into. Daniel's mother was still holding her coffee cup, though she hadn't taken a sip. His father sat straighter now, his posture no longer relaxed. Mark had stopped pretending to be casual, his attention fixed directly on me. And Daniel, he was looking at me like he was seeing something for the first time. Not entirely new, but not entirely familiar either. I took a step forward and returned to my seat, placing my phone calmly beside my cup. No one spoke right away. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable but expectant. Finally, his father cleared his throat. That sounded significant, he said. I nodded once. It is. He leaned forward slightly, care to elaborate. There it was. The invitation. Or perhaps the request. I folded my hands together on the table, resting them lightly against each other. I handle situations that require coordination, I said. Mark let out a small disbelieving laugh. That's one way to put it. I met his gaze not unkindly, it's an accurate one. His smile faded just a little. Daniel shifted beside me. Emily, what exactly is going on? His tone wasn't accusatory, it was searching. I turned to him. There's an issue at the base, I said. It's being managed. You said you'd take command, he replied quietly. Yes. That single word changed something. I saw it land. Not just with him. With everyone. His mother set her cup down more carefully this time. You're in charge of something like that. Sometimes I said, his father studied me now not with dismissal but with focus. That's not typical for administrative personnel, he said. No, I agreed, it isn't. Another pause. He waited. And this time I didn't deflect. I didn't soften. I simply spoke. I didn't come here tonight to mislead anyone, I said calmly, but I also didn't feel the need to introduce myself by my title. Daniel's voice was quieter now. What title? I turned to him fully. And for the first time since I had walked into that house, I answered without holding anything back. I'm a 2-star general, I said, in the United States Army. The words settled into the room like something physical. Heavy. Real. And impossible to ignore. Mark blinked. Once. Twice. As if waiting for a punchline that never came. Daniel's mother didn't move at all. And his father simply stared. You're serious, he said after a moment. Yes, sir. The silence that followed was different from the others. Not tense. Not uncertain. Just undeniable. Because there are certain truths that don't leave room for interpretation. And that was one of them. Mark leaned back slowly in his chair. That's not something people usually leave out. I wasn't trying to hide it, I said. I just didn't think it should define the conversation. He gave a short laugh, though it didn't carry the same confidence as before. Well, it kind of does now. I didn't respond to that. Because he wasn't wrong. Across from me, Daniel's mother finally spoke. You're telling us, she said carefully, that you command troops. Yes, ma'am. How many? Enough that it matters. That answer wasn't meant to be evasive. It was meant to be respectful. She absorbed it slowly. And you've been doing this while presenting yourself as someone who works in administration, I finished gently. Which is still true, just not the whole picture. Her eyes moved over me again, but this time the assessment was different. Not dismissive. Reevaluating. His father exhaled quietly, leaning back into his chair. I see, he said. 2 simple words. But they carried weight. Because what he saw now wasn't what he had expected. Daniel hadn't said anything. Not yet. I turned toward him again. I didn't tell you everything I said, and I understand if that feels like a breach of trust. He looked at me, his expression caught between disbelief and something deeper. You told me enough, he said slowly. I just didn't realize how much more there was. That's fair. Why not just say it, he asked. Because I needed to know something first. What? I met his eyes. Who you were when none of it mattered. He held my gaze for a long moment. Then nodded once. Not fully satisfied. But understanding. His father leaned forward again, resting his elbows on his knees. You understand how this looks from our perspective, he said. I do. You come into our home, present yourself one way, and then... I present myself as I am, I said calmly, just without context. That's not a small omission. No, I agreed, it isn't. He studied me carefully. And what exactly were you hoping to learn? I considered the question. Whether I would be treated with respect, I said, before any titles were involved. The honesty in that answer landed harder than anything else I had said that evening. Because it wasn't about power. It wasn't about position. It was about something simpler. And more revealing. His mother shifted slightly in her seat. We didn't mean any disrespect, she said. I know, I replied. But you have to understand, she continued, we were trying to evaluate. Me, I said. Yes. And now I asked. She hesitated. Because now, the evaluation had changed. Not just in outcome, but in direction. Mark cleared his throat. Well, I guess that explains the phone calls. Yes, I said. And the take command part, he added. Yes. He shook his head slowly. Didn't see that coming. That was the point, I said quietly. The room settled again. But this time there was no returning to what it had been. Because once assumptions break, they don't rebuild the same way. Daniel's father stood up after a moment, walking slowly toward the window. He didn't say anything right away. He just stood there looking out at the darkening yard. Then finally he spoke. I may have misjudged you, he said. It wasn't an apology. Not yet. But it was movement. And sometimes that's where change begins. I nodded once. We all make judgments, I said. The question is what we do after. He turned slightly, considering that. Daniel's mother looked at me again. But now there was no trace of dismissal. Only reconsideration. And perhaps something else. Something quieter. I picked up my cup, taking a slow sip. The coffee had gone cold. But I didn't mind. Because the evening had shifted. Not into conflict. Not into triumph. But into something far more real. The moment after the truth is known. When people have to decide who they are going to be next. For a while no one spoke. It wasn't the strained silence from earlier in the evening. It was heavier than that, more deliberate. The kind that settles in after something shifts and everyone is trying to understand what it means. Daniel's father was still by the window, his back to us, one hand resting lightly against the frame. His shoulders had lost that rigid certainty from before. His mother sat across from me, hands folded, now her posture straighter, not out of formality but awareness. Mark looked down at his empty cup, then back up at me as if trying to recalibrate everything he'd said over the past hour. And Daniel? He hadn't moved. He was still turned toward me, his expression quieter than I had ever seen it. Not angry. Not even upset. Just processing. I set my cup down gently. I didn't mean to create a situation, I said. That wasn't my intention. Daniel's mother shook her head slowly. You didn't, she said. Not exactly. She paused, then added, but you did show us something we weren't expecting. I nodded once. That's fair. Mark let out a short breath. I'll be honest, I feel a little ridiculous. That wasn't the goal either, I said. He gave a small self-aware smile, still. Across the room, Daniel's father turned back toward us. I think he said carefully we may have approached this the wrong way. No one responded immediately. Because those words, simple as they were, carried weight. He walked back toward the table slower than before and took his seat again. I've spent most of my life evaluating people quickly, he continued. It's how I was trained. Business, negotiations. You learn to assess value risk potential. I listened. And tonight he said I did exactly that. His gaze met mine. But I did it without all the information. I held his eyes. Yes, sir, I said quietly. You did. There was no accusation in my voice. Just truth. He exhaled slowly, and I let that judgment shape how I treated you. This time the room stayed silent a little longer. Because now, we were no longer talking about assumptions. We were talking about responsibility. Daniel shifted beside me. Dad? But his father raised a hand slightly, not to stop him, but to finish his thought. I don't like being wrong, he said. But I dislike even more the idea that I was unfair. I considered that. Then I nodded. That matters, I said. His mother looked between us, her expression softer now. We weren't trying to be unkind, she said. I know, I replied. But we were, she admitted. That was the first real acknowledgement. And it didn't come with defensiveness. Just honesty. Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. I should have said something earlier, he said, when I saw where the conversation was going. I turned toward him. You tried. Not enough, he said. I didn't argue with that. Because growth doesn't come from being reassured, it comes from being aware. He looked at me again. I didn't fully understand what you do. Not like this. That's on me, I said. I chose not to explain it. Why, he asked again, more quietly this time. I took a breath. Because I needed to know if you saw me, before everything else. And I held his gaze. I think you're still figuring that out. He didn't flinch. He nodded once. That's fair. Mark cleared his throat again, shifting in his seat. So, just so I'm clear, he said, glancing between us, you're actually in charge of a base. Yes. And those calls. Our part of the job. He let out a low whistle. I made a joke about paperwork. I remember I said. He winced slightly. Yeah, about that. It's all right, I said. You were working with the information you had. That's not much of an excuse, he replied. No, I agreed, but it is an explanation. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. Daniel's mother reached for her cup again, though her hands moved more carefully now. I think she said we've spent a long time measuring people by things that are easy to see. I didn't interrupt. And we forgot that not everything important presents itself that way. Her eyes met mine. That's on us. I inclined my head slightly. It takes awareness to recognize that. It took you showing us, she said. That wasn't my intention, I replied. Maybe not, she said, but it was the result. Daniel's father leaned forward again, his tone steadier now. You said earlier he began that you wanted to see who we were, before we knew who you were. Yes, sir? And now you have... I do. He held my gaze. And what have you concluded? The question wasn't defensive. It was direct. And it deserved a direct answer. I considered my words carefully. I think you care deeply about your son, I said, and you want to protect what he's built. He nodded once. But I also think, I continued, that you rely heavily on visible markers to determine someone's worth. He didn't argue, because he knew it was true. And that can lead to incomplete conclusions. The room stayed quiet, because sometimes the simplest truths are the hardest to respond to. After a moment, he spoke again. You're not wrong. It wasn't easy for him to say. That much was clear. I've spent decades building a certain way of thinking, he added. It doesn't change overnight. I wouldn't expect it to, I said. But it can change, he said. Yes. That word carried more weight than anything else in the conversation. Because it wasn't about the past anymore. It was about what came next. Daniel reached for my hand this time gently. Not out of habit. Out of intention. I'm still here, he said quietly. I know, I replied. And I'm not going anywhere. I looked at him for a long moment. Then stand with me, I said. Not a demand. Not a test. Just a truth. He nodded. I will. The tension that had filled the house earlier was gone. Not replaced with comfort. Not yet. But with something more important. Honesty. And the beginning of understanding. As the evening drew toward its close, things felt different. Not lighter, but clearer. And sometimes that's what matters most. Because clarity doesn't erase what happened, but it gives you a chance to decide what to do with it. When we finally stood to leave, Daniel's mother walked us to the door. Thank you for coming, she said. Thank you for having me, I replied. This time the words carried more meaning. She hesitated for a brief moment, then added, We'd like to see you again soon. I nodded. I'd like that. And I meant it. Because this wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about whether something real could grow from what had been revealed. Outside, the air was cool and quiet. Daniel opened the car door for me again, just as he had earlier. But this time the gesture felt different. Less practiced. More present. As I settled into the seat, I looked back at the house one last time. Not with judgment. Not with satisfaction. But with a quiet understanding. Because tonight hadn't been about showing who I was. It had been about showing something else entirely. What people reveal when they think you don't matter. And what they do when they realize you do. The drive back to my apartment was quiet. Daniel kept both hands on the wheel, eyes forward, jaw set, in that way men sometimes have when they are trying to think and not speak too soon. I appreciated that about him. A careless sentence can bruise more deeply than a hard one, especially after a night like that. I watched the road lights pass across the windshield in long yellow streaks. For most people, the evening would have felt like a victory. A room full of people had underestimated me. Then they had learned the truth. Their faces had changed. Their tone had changed. Their certainty had cracked. That is the kind of moment some people wait years for. But I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Not physically. I had worked longer days under far worse pressure. This was different. This was the quiet kind of tired that comes when you realize love does not only ask whether two people care for each other. It asks whether they can stand together when other people make that difficult. Daniel finally spoke when we stopped at a red light. I should have told them more before tonight. I looked at him. He didn't turn toward me. Not your rank. That wasn't mine to tell. But I should have prepared them better. Or at least warned you more clearly about how they could be. I had a sense. That's not the same. No, I said, it isn't. The light turned green. He drove on. After a few more seconds, he said, "Were you testing me too?" I took my time before answering. Yes. He absorbed that without reacting. I figured, he said quietly. I wasn't trying to trap you. I know. But I needed to see whether you would let me sit there alone. That one hurt him. I saw it in his face, even in the dim light. I did, he said. Not completely. But enough. I didn't answer right away because there was no kindness in pretending he was wrong. Yes, I said, enough. He swallowed and nodded. That was one thing I had always respected about Daniel. He could be proud, but he wasn't dishonest with himself once the truth found him. I froze, he said. I kept thinking if I pushed back too hard it would make things worse. That's a common mistake, I said softly. He gave a sad little laugh. That sounds like something you'd say in a briefing. It probably is. For the first time all night, a small warmth passed between us. Then it faded back into seriousness. I love my parents, he said, but I saw it tonight. I saw what they were doing. And what were they doing? They were measuring you. I nodded. And I let them, he added. That's the part you need to remember. He pulled into the parking lot of my building a few minutes later but didn't turn off the engine right away. I don't want a marriage where you have to defend yourself alone, he said. Neither do I. I don't want you to feel like you have to hide who you are around my family. I didn't hide because of them, I said. I withheld because of what I needed to learn. He turned toward me then. And what did you learn about me? I looked at him for a long moment. That you love me, I said. But love needs a backbone. He looked down at his hands. That's fair. It's not meant to wound you. I know, he said, but it should. That answer stayed with me. Because sometimes a wound is not punishment. Sometimes it is the place where growth begins. 2 days passed before his mother called. I was in my office at the base when my assistant knocked lightly and opened the door. Ma'am, Daniel's mother is on your personal line. I looked up from the folder in front of me. That surprised me. Thank you. Put her through. A moment later, her voice came over the phone. Emily. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore. There was a pause. Please call me Patricia. I leaned back slightly. All right, Patricia. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. I looked at the stack of reports on my desk, then at the clock. You're all right. Another pause. I wanted to apologize. I said nothing. Not because I wanted to make her uncomfortable, but because an apology deserves room. Too often, people rush to rescue others from the hard part of saying it. She continued. I judged you before I knew you. I asked questions that sounded polite but were not kind, and I made assumptions about your worth based on a dress, a job title, and my own narrow idea of what success looks like. Her voice wavered slightly at the end. That mattered. I appreciate you saying that, I said. I've been thinking about it since you left. Harold has too, though he is slower to admit things. That made me smile faintly. I understand. I don't expect you to forget it. I won't. No, she said softly. I suppose you shouldn't. There was honesty in that too. Then she asked, would you consider coming to dinner again, just you and Daniel? No cousin, no interrogation, just dinner. I looked through the window of my office out toward the flag, moving in the afternoon wind. I would consider it, I said. That's more than I deserve. Maybe, I replied, but it's enough for a start. That evening, Daniel came over with takeout from a little Italian place near my building. He brought 2 paper bags, one tired smile, and no excuses. We ate at my kitchen table, the kind with one uneven leg and a scratch near the corner from when I had moved it myself after a long deployment. Halfway through dinner, he said, Mom called you. She did. She called me after. I waited. She said she apologized. She did. He nodded. Dad wants to talk too, in person. That will be harder for him. I know. Are you ready for that? He looked at me. I think I am. That wasn't my question. He set his fork down. Then he said, I'm ready to stand beside you this time. I believed he meant it. But life had taught me that meaning well is only the first step. The real test comes when comfort is threatened, when family disapproves, when old patterns ask to be obeyed. So I didn't say good. I didn't say that fixes it. I simply reached across the table and took his hand. "We'll see," I said. He nodded. And for now that was enough. The second dinner happened the following Sunday. This time I did not wear the old dress. I also did not wear a uniform. I chose a simple gray blouse, dark slacks, and a necklace my mother had given me before she passed. Nothing flashy, nothing hidden, just me. When Daniel and I arrived, his father opened the door. Harold Whitmore looked smaller than he had the first night. Not weak, just less armored. "Emily," he said. "Mr. Whitmore." He stepped aside. "Please come in." The house looked the same, but it felt different. There were no extra guests, no performative table setting, no cousin making jokes from the side. Patricia greeted me in the kitchen with a sincere hug that lasted just long enough to be awkward, but not false. Dinner was simple: pot roast potatoes, green beans. Real food, no performance. For a while we talked about ordinary things. Weather, Daniel's work, a neighbor's old maple tree coming down in the last storm. Then Harold set down his fork. "I owe you an apology," he said. Everyone went still. He looked directly at me. "I measured you by the wrong things. Worse than that, I allowed my pride to make me comfortable doing it." I listened, hands resting in my lap. "I have spent years telling myself I'm a good judge of character," he continued. "But that night I was not judging character. I was judging status." His voice grew quieter. "And if you had not turned out to be someone important, I might never have seen the problem." That was the first thing he said that truly reached me, because it was the truth beneath the truth. I nodded slowly. "That matters more than the apology," I said. He looked confused. I explained. "You didn't just regret misjudging a general. You recognized you would have owed the same respect to an administrative worker." His face tightened with feeling. "Yes," he said, "that's what I'm trying to learn." And in that moment I believed him. Not completely. Not perfectly. But enough to begin. The second dinner ended without tension. That more than anything told me something had shifted. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. When Daniel and I stepped out onto the front porch, Patricia followed us to the door again. This time her smile wasn't measured or polite, it was softer, uncertain, but real. "I'm glad you came," she said. "So am I replied. And I meant it. Because reconciliation doesn't always feel warm at first. Sometimes it feels like two people choosing not to walk away. Harold stood just behind her, one hand resting on the doorframe. He didn't say much as we left, but he gave a small nod. It was a simple gesture. But it carried weight. The drive home felt different from the one a week before. There was still quiet between Daniel and me, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was thoughtful, settled. After a few minutes, he reached over and took my hand without looking away from the road. "They meant it," he said. "I know. I've never seen my dad talk like that. People change when they're willing to see themselves clearly." He let out a slow breath. I almost didn't. I turned toward him. "But you did." "Because of you." "No," I said gently, "because you chose to." That mattered. Because change forced by someone else rarely lasts. But change chosen, earned, that stays. He nodded slightly as if storing that away. "I don't want to ever put you in that position again," he said. "You will," I replied calmly. He blinked. "What?" I smiled faintly. "Not like that, but life has a way of testing people in different forms." He thought about that. "So what do I do when it happens again?" "Stand sooner," I said. "Speak earlier. Don't wait for things to become uncomfortable before you decide what you believe." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "I can do that." "I believe you can." A few weeks passed. Life returned to its usual rhythm. Early mornings, long days, brief calls that carried more weight than words, the steady responsibility that came with a role I had never taken lightly. At the base, nothing had changed. Rank still mattered. Decisions still had consequences. People still stood when I entered a room. But something inside me had settled differently. Because outside of that world beyond the gates, beyond the structure, I had been reminded of something just as important. Who you are when none of that is visible. And how people treat you when they don't know. One afternoon, as I was reviewing a set of reports, my assistant stepped in. "Ma'am, you have a visitor." I glanced up. "Who is it?" "Mr. Whitmore." I paused for a fraction of a second. "Send him in." Harold stepped into my office with a level of formality that hadn't been there before. Not stiff, just respectful. "General," he said. "Mr. Whitmore." He looked around briefly, taking in the room, the flags, the maps, the quiet order of everything. "This is impressive," he said. "It's functional," I replied. He gave a small nod, then sat when I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "I didn't come to take much of your time," he said. "You're here. That means it matters." He accepted that. For a moment he seemed to search for the right words. "I've been thinking a lot," he said finally. "About that night, about how easily I made up my mind about you." I listened. "I built a career on reading people," he continued, "and I got comfortable believing I was good at it. That happens. But I wasn't reading you," he said. "I was reading what I expected to see." "That's more common than you think." He nodded slowly. "I wanted to thank you," he said. That surprised me. "For what?" "For not using your position to make a point." I leaned back slightly. That wouldn't have taught anything. "No," he agreed. "It would have just made me defensive." "That's not the same as learning." He let out a quiet breath. "Exactly." There was a pause. Then he added, "I've been trying to look at people differently since then." "How so?" "By asking myself one question first." I waited. "What if I'm wrong?" I nodded. "That's a good place to start." When he left, I sat there for a few minutes longer than usual. Not thinking about work, not thinking about rank. Just reflecting. Because in all my years of service, I had learned a great deal about leadership. About responsibility. About making decisions when the cost of being wrong was high. But that night and everything that followed had reminded me of something just as important. That leadership doesn't begin with authority. It begins with how you see people. And whether you give them the dignity of being more than your first impression. A month later, Daniel and I stood together at a small family gathering. Nothing formal, just a backyard barbecue at his parents' house. This time there were no questions about my job. No careful evaluations. No quiet tests. Instead, Patricia handed me a plate and asked about my week. Mark, still a little embarrassed, kept his jokes light and harmless. And Harold simply treated me as part of the family. Not because of what I was, but because of who I had shown myself to be, and who he had chosen to become. As the sun began to set, Daniel stepped closer to me, his hand resting lightly at my back. "You were right," he said. "About what?" "That night wasn't about proving who you are." I looked at him. "It was about showing who everyone else was." I smiled softly. "And what we chose to do after that." He nodded. "And I'm glad we didn't walk away." "So am I. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. People will show you who they are when they think you have nothing to offer them. That moment, quiet, unguarded, is where truth lives. But what matters more is what happens next. Whether they stay the same, or choose to grow, and whether you give them the space to do it. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been judged too quickly, or if you've ever had to face your own assumptions, take a moment to reflect on it. And if you believe stories like this matter, consider sharing it with someone who might need the reminder. Because sometimes the smallest shift in how we see each other can change everything.